So we're going to hear a little bit of an unusual perspective now. I'm Howard Gleckman, by the way. I'm the editor of the Tax Policy Center blog, TaxVox. And we're going to hear about the campaign and tax policy from the perspective of journalists. You get to hear a little bit about how they see the campaign, about how they do what they do. And to help us, I'd like to welcome three highly respected journalists to talk about covering taxes, tax policy, and tax politics. Sitting next to me is Catherine Rampell, who's a columnist for the Washington Post. She writes frequently about tax policy. And interesting enough, before joining the Post, she wrote about theater for the New York Times. So perhaps she brings a special perspective to our political discussion. Bernie Becker is a tax reporter for Politico and produces the morning tax report at 5 o'clock in the morning.
I don't sleep a lot, so.
He's a brave man. And Jean Sahadi is senior writer for CNN Money, where she covers taxes and budget issues, among other interests. Before we get started, I'd like to give you just one little quick bit of background. Political campaigns are covered by two different kinds of journalists. There are those who spend their days on the road with the candidates, and those who cover policy issues raised in the campaign from the relative comfort of their cubicles. The three folks joining me today are more the latter than the former. So what we're going to hear more about is the policy issues and not about the days on the bus. Let me start with actually kind of jump off from where Ruth started this morning. So we have political candidates, most of the political candidates left, who have proposed enormously interesting, big, huge, controversial, creative ideas on tax policy, and nobody's talking about them, except maybe for the wonks in this room. There seems to be very little interest. The candidates themselves don't seem to be talking about them very much. I'd like to get a sense from each of the panelists what they think is going on, how it can be that these really important tax policy issues are getting such little attention. Catherine, you want to start?
I lavish lots of attention on them. I would say there are a few things happening here. One is that policy in general hasn't gotten that much attention in this campaign, right? It's more about the personalities. I mean, this is true in political campaigns more generally, especially in presidential elections. So I think it's partly that. Tax, in particular, as a subset of policy, can seem kind of dry. No offense. I don't think it's dry, but for a large swath of the public, I think that's the case. And I think also when I've talked with economists, let's say, about these issues who are not focused on tax, they're interested in them, but they say, well, it doesn't really matter so much because they're going to promise the moon today, but what whoever ends up in office actually gets done will look very different because the politics will be very different, and they won't be able to just, sort of fantasize about what they want to get through. So why are we really paying that much attention to their fantasy plan that's coming out now? So I think it's a combination of those two things.
Bernie, what do you think?
So I think if you start with the premise that this is a policy-light campaign, which I think is true, the things that have caught fire are, Trump on protectionist type things like immigration and trade, and I just don't think, tax really captures people's imagination that way. I don't think people are sort of feel in the day-to-day life that sort of this is a huge threat the way maybe immigration and trade are to their daily lives. So I think that's it, and I think also if we're debating these GOP plans, which are massive and interesting, but it's sort of a delivery mechanism. They're all kind of saying the same thing. They're going to give larger tax cuts to the wealthy, smaller tax cuts on down the line, and so where's the difference? I mean, in other issues, they're not talking about them a ton, but there are differences, and on taxes, it's more of a delivery mechanism type thing.
Gene, how is the coverage different this time than it was, say, 4 years ago?
In 2012?
Yeah.
Well, as we talked about, I think while there is potential for teachable moments in this campaign because nobody gives a hoot about these plans, it really differs from 2012, where we learned a lot about the tax code through Mitt Romney's public mistakes. We got to teach people what it meant to have people with no federal income tax liability, how many there were, and where that was going, and that's all thanks to Bob Williams. That's entirely Bob Williams' lesson to the country. And interestingly, though, that's not of interest to people anymore. Trump, his plan would actually increase to something like 50%, according to TPC the number of the people with no federal income tax liability. That nobody paid any attention to that stat whatsoever. So I just really think this is a passion play campaign. The people who love Sanders, the people who love Trump, they're the ones coming in and making the most noise. And what they're hearing has nothing to do with the tax plans, really, I think.
So it's also interesting that the candidates themselves are not talking about their tax plans.
No.
And I think to some degree they drive what reporters write about, and they're not talking about it. So why do you, if you're a candidate, check the box with this great big aggressive plan and then bury it? Catherine, any theory about that?
I mean, they did announce their plans with a big splash when they announced them. Maybe they didn't play as well as talking about building a wall. That gets big cheers every time Donald Trump says it on the campaign trail. I'm not sure tax cuts really gets the same amount of enthusiasm, but he did have a press conference when he released it. He said a lot of things that were completely wrong about the tax plan, including that rich people were going to be in for a world of pain, or however he phrased it, which is obviously not what people who have analyzed it have suggested will be the case. But he talked about it. There were press calls when Jeb Bush released his plan and the others as well. So it's not as if they released these plans under, at 2 a.m. on a Sunday and just buried them. They did try to have some press around them, but it just seems like they're not catching the public's imagination as much.
But other than the brief discussion between Cruz and Rubio about VATs, what I haven't heard at all in any of the debates, for example, is anybody saying my tax plan is better than your tax plan, and here's why. And Jean, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I'm surprised Rubio chose the VAT route because, as I said, I really don't think the VAT should ever be discussed out loud because it's so hard for people to understand who don't do the work that you guys do. I don't know. I just don't think they're taking it very seriously. I mean, I know that Rubio has a really creative plan and Cruz has a creative plan, and I can see why tax experts are excited about it, but there's been so much extremist talk in the campaign, and everyone's responding to what Trump says, so that takes up a lot of oxygen and a lot of space. I don't know. I think it's pretty interesting what they're proposing, but until we get to the general election, and even then, I'm not sure people are going to really delve too deep.
I would also add on this point that touting their tax plans also highlights some of their vulnerabilities, which is that they're not paid for. So if they talk about the size of their tax cuts, that's going to raise questions about, well, what are you going to do to offset those tax cuts? And they can say, big growth, yay, and hope that the question goes away. But people are going to kind of poke at that bruise for a little bit if they do talk too much about it.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I also think this is sort of a two-way street, right? I mean, I think, we're not on the bus every day, as you were saying earlier, but I'm assuming they're talking about this somewhat on the road when they're doing it, and I'm imagining that the voters just aren't as interested. And so if they're not as interested, why are you going to waste your time on this? And as we were saying, I mean, these are massive tax cuts, but they're kind of more in agreement here than they are on other issues. So it's sort of belaboring the point to sort of argue over nothing, and we're not sure people really care. So
Let me ask a little bit about the way journalism has changed. And there's a couple of issues that are interesting. The first one, Gina, I want to start with you, is when you write a story about taxes now, everyone knows instantly, still, everybody internally in the organization knows how many page views you got. And
In here?
No. How much does that drive the decisions you make about what to write about? For example, you said never talk about VATs in public. Right. Is that because people don't read stories about VATs?
No, I just think it's really, well, especially in public discussion, I think it's very hard to absorb. I think it's easier to read it and get the point, but I don't decide I'm going to write about every presidential tax plan that's put out there. I may focus it on what it means to you. I might focus it more on the individual side than the corporate side, like what Ruth was saying. Sometimes those 100-word paragraphs get sliced because they're like, oh, we're not going to get into corporate taxes now, are we? I would like to. I think that the distortionary effect in Trump's plan, and I think Rubio's plan, would be enormous because there would be such an incentive to shift from an individual taxpayer to a business taxpayer if you're going to get a much lower rate. But it is a tough sell with a general audience that is still, again, in the thrall of candidates.
Do editors say, I mean, Len had this interesting discussion at the beginning here, if you were to say, you know, I want to do a story about incidents.
About incidents?
About incidents.
No, I would get fired, Lynn. I try to preserve my job, so yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
question. I mean,
Right.
Is there some sense of, you know, it's just too complicated, we can't take that on?
Well, if I can make it really understandable in very plain English, and I can give it kind of it does have to resonate with the reader. If it's not going to resonate with the reader if it's about just corporate taxes and they're not a business, it's a little bit harder to just do that. Inversion was a tough sell, even though, as Chairman Brady said, you know, people do worry about companies leaving the country. It's not like people are up in arms about inversion. I mean, in general, I've found.
I think the word choice matters too.
Right.
So using incidents
Right.
versus fairness or other sort of value-laden terms. I mean, there's a trade-off there, right, in terms of accessibility and like what the connotations or how subjective the words are. You can use a more clinical term like incidents, but you're going to turn off a lot of readers. You can use a more loaded term like fairness or inequality or something like that, and you're probably going to get more readers, and you just have to kind of balance the two.
Right, and you want to be fair to the issue. Like, you do not want to skew it just to get the eyeballs, because that's just irresponsible.
So Bernie, you write for a more technical audience, a more expert audience. Could you imagine doing a story on tax incidents and who really pays for a tax increase? Or who
Well, it
really
depends on the pitch. What Len's pitch was, it would depend on. But yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, you know, there is an audience out there of people who are mostly in this town and mostly working on K Street or in, you know, in the halls of Congress that care about that. But, you know, there are stories that we write that sometimes go to a larger audience, and, you know, I think there's been a dearth of the tax stories of that recently, just because I think it's something that, you know, we've been sort of stalled for a while, and a lot of the things we could talk about would be those more technical aspects, and, you know, I'm just not sure how large that audience is broadly, as they've been.
Catherine, let me ask about space. You write in a fairly constrained space, 700 words, 750 words, whatever it is. How difficult does that make it for you to take on issues like tax? You do it, but do you ever sit there and think, as Ruth was saying, you know, I'd really like to do this, but I can't do this in 700 words.
750.
750,
Yeah.
excuse me. Every word counts.
Plus or minus like 3 words.
Oh,
It's
well,
very
there you
tight.
go.
At least at the Washington Post. I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Going statutes, yeah.
Okay. I mean, yes, there are space constraints. It's a challenge. In some ways, I think it's a fun challenge, you know, to try to figure out what's the clearest possible way I can boil this down, and make this not, you know, a several thousand word treatise, but try to get to the key points that I care about, that I think readers should know about, without sacrificing too much nuance. I mean, one way that I try to tackle that is just by like taking on smaller bites of the subject, or you know, using so rather than like doing a comprehensive piece about everything that's in Jeb Bush's tax plan, one thing that I did actually with the help of, I think Bob was very helpful on this piece, I don't know if he remembers what I'm talking about, was I looked at how Jeb Bush's tax plan would affect Jeb Bush. And I went through and I did his taxes for him. And that was something that, it took a lot of work on my end, but actually it didn't require that much verbiage in the final product. And it was like a nice lens into one particular angle of his plan. What does this mean for rich people, essentially, using Jeb as sort of like a prototypical rich person. And, you know, just finding interesting ways to come at the subject matter, and like I said, smaller bites is one way to tackle these things, because I think that they are really important issues. Finding ways to give readers who don't have expertise access to these topics is important to me, and I think it's, like I said, sometimes it's a fun challenge as well.
Jane, how do you tackle that challenge, the space challenge? Do you have the same constraints?
I do. Well, technically I don't, because I write online, but the attention span online is pretty short. So 750 is on the long side. Better if you could do it at 650. But in the case of the tax plans, what I tend to do is I kind of give the nut of what the plan's about up top, so that if that's all you're going to read, that's all you're going to read. But then I kind of break out some of the really big elements, and then what the economic effects would be and what the budgetary effects would be. And then I link right back to the report if someone wants the 50-page treatise on it. It's full service, whatever you want. You can take fast food, full dinner, whatever.
Nice thing about writing online is you can include a link.
I include a lot of links for that reason, because because you guys are so great at informing us, and you give us such detail, and you don't want to be irresponsible about conveying that detail, and you don't want to give the shaft to some really important ones. But if you can't do all of them, you at least want to give somebody the option to go read for themselves.
I'm actually curious, how often do people follow the links?
Okay, I got to ask Leo back at the office. I don't do the metrics. I don't know.
Sorry about that.
But yes, there are metrics that can show that kind of behavior.
Let's talk a little bit more about substance. Bernie, you did I thought, a very interesting piece the other day talking about the disconnect between the populist rhetoric of Republican candidates and the substance of their tax plans. Talk a little bit about how that disconnect is and how people might be responding to it.
Yeah, I mean, so as I was saying earlier, I mean, if you look at Trump as this phenomenon, it's not policy based, right? We think it's probably more based on his personality, based on he's the one that'll take charge and sort of end this, weakness that America has. But if you look at his actual policies, I mean, he's talking about on the healthcare side, negotiating with drug companies, which is, an idea on the left, but something that sort of has resonance among voters, and other places like trade, immigration. But on taxes, he has this sort of very standard Republican doctrinaire plan, and it's not that far removed from the others. So I think it sort of gets to the point of, I don't think taxes are as big a deal in this campaign. I don't think, protecting the status quo, like protecting people's jobs, is something he's fighting for, but you don't want to protect the tax code. No one likes a tax code, so you can't be like, okay, we'll just sort of nibble around the edges here, because that's not his personality either. So I think it's just it's a weird place where, this campaign has been, the GOP has just decided we're kind of all on the same page when it comes to taxes. It's maybe like the last bastion of the old school, conservatism. And so it's just sort of been swept aside, and there are these other more populist issues that everyone seems to be concentrating on.
Do you think this is going to change in the general election, particularly if Trump gets the Republican nomination?
I don't think we can really say. I mean, every prediction we made about Trump has been so wrong that I think it would be silly of us to try. I mean, if you had told people 6 months ago he would have won 3 of the first 4 contests, I think people would have thought you were crazy. So, it'll be interesting to see if you're presuming that Hillary Clinton is the person that's going to be facing him, whether she's going to make more of a point about the fact that, this guy's tax plan is going to lose $10 trillion, and, these guys are talking about the sort of existential threat of a $19 trillion debt. So how do you reconcile those? And that's not the thing they're talking about on the GOP side. You can see that coming in on the Democrat, or when it's a general election. But again, if that matters in an election where it seems to be more about this sort of larger-than-life persona of one of the candidates, I don't think we can really predict with any certainty how those sort of more detailed parts will come in.
Catherine, do you think these tax issues will be more engaged in the general election?
It's hard to say. I mean, to the extent that, so assuming Trump is the nominee, or even if the other supposedly more moderate candidates are the nominee, who have plans that also lose trillions of dollars over the next decade, I think it's still kind of hard for the Democratic nominee, presumably Hillary Clinton, to focus too much on tax issues without sounding really pedantic, right? I mean, and part of the tenor of this campaign is that, like, we don't really like experts, we don't really like the establishment, they're all the elites. This is about kind of going with your gut. And I think that there are some very weak points in the Republican candidates' tax plans that are, if you're their opponent, are worth exploiting. But I don't know how well they'll play, given that saying, like, you're going to be bad for the budget and your numbers don't add up. I don't know that really has quite the populist ring that you kind of need in this campaign. But like Bernie said, every prediction we've made is wrong, so who knows?
But so there's a different contrast too. Could you imagine, Gene, I'll ask you this, a debate between Clinton and Trump that goes something like this. Clinton says, I am proposing kitchen table tax benefits to help you, educate your kids and take care of your mom and get better health care. And Trump says, and I'm going to grow the economy.
He's going to say your life is terrific.
I'm
going to make it terrific for you.
Is that a debate we're going to see?
He's going to grow the economy, and she's going to give breaks to the middle class?
Yeah.
I honestly think it's all going to depend on Trump's mood, because his response to substantive questions is pretty pat every time. His campaign's response to substantive questions are completely non-responsive in a way that I've not seen from a campaign before. And I've mentioned this as well. I asked several times, could you put me on the phone with a policy person to answer questions about your tax plan? And the response I almost always get back is, his plan speaks for itself. So then I talk to myself after I hang the phone up. And a colleague of mine was writing about his oft-made promise to bring jobs back from China. How exactly, we wanted to know. We called the campaign. The campaign basically said, and she reported this in her story, it's tough to make America great again, and Mr. Trump's the only one who can do it. So it's very hard to report more in depth on what the proposals are. Now, he may decide, if Hillary Clinton and her strategists decide that they can get at him in one particular way and get him to respond in a way that a Wall Street Journal, the editorial person in the CBS debate, tried very hard to. Unless that happens, I don't know that we're going to have a substantive discussion.
If I could just there's one, so carried interest is one of the ways he's saying that he's pitching his plan as, more for the little guys. He's going to tax the hedge fund guys, even though they don't really get carried interest, but that's another story. But, it's so narrow as to be meaningless almost, what he does on carried interest, and people have pointed that out, and it just sort of it goes into the ether. So I think these sorts of...
I also don't think the general public knows what carried interest is.
I don't know what carried interest is, so...
So this frustration, you're hearing a little bit of it here. Catherine, you wrote a column a couple of weeks ago, and the first sentence was, speaking to the reader, Donald Trump thinks you're an idiot. What generated that column?
Just a lot of frustration with things that he said on economic policies and otherwise that just don't make any sense, and so obviously don't make any sense. I think that column I was making fun of his comments, if I'm thinking of the right one, his comments on one of the Sunday shows where he said, I'm so humble. I'm the most humble guy ever, something like that. And I was like, is he doing a comedy bit? This is so obviously not true. And yet he says these things that are completely at odds with other things he says, his plans that he puts out. I mean, that one was about his characterizations of himself, but you could talk about the same the same kinds of themes in his tax plan, where he says, I'm really the rich are gonna pay. I'm gonna pay this tax plan is gonna be so painful to me. And I'm like, and you look at the plan, and I forget what the actual numbers are. People here will know better, but people like him will do the best of anyone else, unless he secretly gets a lot of money from carried interest, which I'm not aware of. Even if he does, right, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. But he has no shame about saying things that are blatantly wrong, blatantly false. But if he says it with enough confidence, then he gets away with it. And I think a lot of people know, a lot of his supporters, I think, recognize this, that he's not being straight with them all the time, about whether it's about his humility or his actual policy plans to the extent that they exist. But they kind of don't care, because so what? And again, I get back to this question I have about how do you kind of attack him, or how do you critique him even? Attack is more of a loaded word. How do you critique him for parts of his plan that various plans that don't add up or don't make sense, when he's just going to turn around and say and suggest that you're being pedantic for caring that things add up, or caring that there's any sort of sense of consistency. And it's very hard to, I don't know, it's very hard to continue to pursue those kinds of lines of inquiry about his tax plans or otherwise, if if his response is something Pat-like or his
For itself.
speaks for itself, like what does that even mean? I don't know. I just find it very frustrating.
So it's interesting to me that we're, like everybody, we're gravitating to Donald Trump. And I think about my years covering political campaigns. No other politician could have gotten away with this. If a politician was proposing something that was internally inconsistent, stories would appear on the front page of newspapers, and they would point out his inconsistency over and over and over again. And eventually, the candidate would finally say, you know, that famous question, "Do you regret it?" You know, right? And he'd say, "I'm sorry." But that's not happening this time. And is part of that just because, in a sense, the journalists are playing his game, that they're he's wearing them down, just like he's worn down his opponents, and people are throwing up their hands and saying, I can't write about this.
I don't think so. I think people have pointed it out, and he just sort of, as Catherine was saying, he can sort of explain it away in a very Trumpian, like, yeah, no, not true, and people just move on. And I think it also sort of, you know, it's an angrier electorate now than it was 4 years ago, and they're sort of like, you know, they're tired of people telling them that this particular policy and this is the way to do it. When you just have someone who they believe is sort of larger than life enough to actually turn the ship around, then they'll sort of go for it, and sort of facts are sort of, I think, secondary to that sometimes.
So let me ask you, let's flip parties for a little bit. Let's talk about the mirror image in some sense of Donald Trump, who's Bernie Sanders. Are the Sanders voters, they feel the same way? Don't bother me with the details. I just love this guy because he's turning the world inside out, and that's what I want?
I can't, I'm not in touch with Bernie Sanders supporters per se. I know his campaign has been very responsive when we've had questions about his plans. I think regardless of what you think about his proposals, what you think about his pay-fors, he has been very upfront about what they are, and they're willing to talk to you about it. I think that the Democratic Party, that immediately, as soon as they heard about that premium tax and raising tax on the middle class, were like, whoop, Nancy Pelosi's like, no way, we're not doing that. Is sort of like the GOP with Trump. They're like, no way are we doing that. And yet, these are the guys that have the most passionate supporters. I think the premium tax hasn't really sunk in. Maybe people are hearing Bernie Sanders' message, which is, I'm going to save you way more money than I'm going to increase your taxes by. And the free healthcare, free college really does resonate. I don't know. I'm
Catherine, any thoughts about Sanders?
I hear from a lot of Sanders supporters. I don't know how representative they are of all Sanders supporters, but I have written a few columns lately about his challenges with math, too. You know, if I can sort of impute motive to some extent, I think Trump just doesn't care about whether the math adds up. I think Sanders has some policy advisors who do care, but I think that they're wrong, and they're making weird assumptions about like what labor force participation rates are going to do and things like that. But whenever I've pointed that out and said something to the effect of, these numbers don't make sense, I do get a lot of angry emails from Bernie supporters saying, you're just out to attack Bernie. You're trying to bring him down, you're an agent of the establishment, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that they don't hear like the critique of the policy itself and take it very personally on behalf of their chosen candidate. So I do think that there's a little bit of a similar reflexive circling the wagons amongst, at least, again, the supporters who take the time to write to me, who may not be all supporters.
I think there's a fatigue generally. I'm not going to impute motive on this either. There's 7 years of basically 3 yards in a cloud of dust sort of policy and progress up backwards, but it's sort of playing very much in the middle. And I think people are just kind of tired of that. So when you have people promise them things, which we here would say was like, I don't think that's going to happen. They don't, I think people are willing to listen to things that seem sort of grander than we've been talking about for a long, long time.
I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions, but I just want to switch gears for just a minute and ask about international tax. Chairman Brady was here talking about it just before. And I'm going to ask Jean and Catherine first, and then turn to Bernie. Is it possible to write about international tax for a general audience?
It's possible. I've done it. I think you're not going to get as many readers as you would if you talk about some other tax issues, or if you talk about things that are wholly unrelated to tax, for that matter. But yeah, I think it's possible. I think you kind of have to find a way in that makes it accessible, that helps people identify with what you're talking about. And sometimes that's through like characters. If you talk about a person and how, or a company or something like that, and how they would be affected by various tax plans, as opposed to more abstract, only numbers-based. But it's possible. Again, it's challenging, but there are ways to do it.
Jean, how do you do it?
I think if you seize on something, oh my God, I get so much trouble. Alan Sloan at Fortune made a big deal about inversions being unpatriotic, and that really took off as people really picked up on that. It's unpatriotic to invert. So we wrote a story. Is it really that unpatriotic? Here's what the law says. Here's what companies have to do. To help people think about what the assertion is. So I try to get into it that way. Or I know I've talked to Ed Kleinbart in the past about the myth of cash being trapped abroad when it's not really trapped abroad. In fact, it can be used here in lots of ways without being taxed. So in that sense, to make it a teachable moment, but it's not the sexiest.
But I do think that, I was talking about like sort of using characters, and some of that is household name companies, so not like even a physical, right. Not even a person, but like Burger King.
Mm-hmm. Right, and
Tim Hortons.
Tim Hortons, sorry.
So Burger King, it's this iconic American brand. I think that's, if you can use that as sort of an entry point into talking about these issues, as opposed to like even like a pharmaceutical company that may, have a very high market cap, but like people haven't heard of. If you choose companies or people that readers are likely to have heard of, I think that's one way in.
So, Bernie, you got a little different issue. You guys can cover every twist and turn about this, but is there some point where people say, not another story about another guy saying this isn't going to happen this year?
Yeah, I was going to say, when you say, can you write about this for an audience, I was like, I hope so. That's what I write about.
You're out of business if you can't, yeah.
I think if you look at what Catherine and Jean were talking about, on some level, the entire international tax reform issue fits in with the politics of the day. You've got sort of big name companies like Apple and whoever who may not face the same tax liabilities and have ways around things that the hardware store down the street has. And so that sort of broadly fits in with where the electorate is in some ways, and so I think you can write about it in that way, and that's sort of where the debate has gone. I think people who are for this have had to really shift their message in a way to say that, look, this isn't just about Apple, this is about their supply chain and the people who want to buy Apple, and so you have to. And if we don't move now, those people will be hurt just as much as these larger companies. And so I think, in that case, yes, I think there are ways into it. The other thing, though, is that I've been covering tax reform on the Hill for 5 years now, and I think the things that have changed in that time have been really not much, if we're going to be honest about it. So I think you do have to. There are people who care about the sort of who said what today, and does that sort of move us an inch here or an inch there, but I do think people are sort of tired of the sort of broad narrative of tax reform is going to happen someday,
So the boy who cried wolf,
exactly.
A little bit, yeah.
Exactly. Let's give you all a chance to ask some questions. Wait for the microphone, tell us who you are, and please make it a question and not a speech. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I think we're all scratching our heads about Donald Trump, but to me, he represents a tremendous amount of anger in this country. And just the other day, he said, I love uneducated voters, which I think is the most...
Poorly educated.
Poorly educated, which is the most truthful thing I think you said on the trail. But the point is, my fear here is that, and I'm going to ask this as a question to a lot of people in this room, I think, is that how do you get the voter to trust the establishment again? I mean, how do we change what's going on in this town to make people out there less angry so that they vote more intelligently?
Catherine, you want to start with that one? And by the way, just to sort of add a little something to that, so you all are part of the lamestream media, right? And you've got to kind of get over that hurdle now too. So how do you?
Everybody. Megyn Kelly's part of the lamestream media now too. Like, it's just if the right candidate turns on you, the right candidate being Donald Trump, suddenly. You have liberal media bias too. I don't know, is the short answer. I think it's very difficult to write things that are explanatory, that rely on facts, that do any sort of fact-checking without getting pelted with this sort of pedantry label that I keep coming back to. A lot of what I do, I write opinion, but I also write a lot of explanatory stuff, or I'll try to sort of explain things with my own spin on it, right? And my aspiration is to reach people outside of this room. People inside of this room understand this stuff already, like we're talking about tax policy. I'm trying to reach, the readers in Biloxi who read my column and help them understand these issues. And it's challenging because focusing on facts has become a sign of elitism, which is very bizarre. And I guess I guess the way to overcome that is to just try to make things accessible, to try to find common ground or touchstones that people can identify with, whether it's like a sexy company or something else. But it's very challenging when expertise or facts themselves are signs of the enemy, are seen as tools of the enemy. In the lead up to this campaign, a lot of news organizations invested in fact-checking operations. They existed in 2012 as well, but a lot of news organizations, through a lot of bodies at those efforts, which initially it seemed like would hold politicians to account, right? They would say something in a debate, and it might be wrong, but there would be fast action fact checkers who could be live blogging. Oh no, that's not true. What they said about unemployment isn't true. What they said about Obamacare isn't true. Whatever. And it seems like it's almost had the opposite effect, that the politicians just say, oh well, the fact checkers are biased because they're members of the establishment. If they say anything that I say is wrong, you can't trust them. So it's really a paradox, I guess. How do you help people understand things? How do you help debunk things that are false, or shed light on things that are poorly understood, without just being pigeonholed as, too concerned with the minutia, too concerned with fact. It's a very strange situation to be in, and I don't exactly know the answer.
Jean, how do you break through?
I think we're a little bit in danger, not just the media, but the intellectual elites who are sitting here, of sounding awful. The people who really support Trump, they're Americans too. He's getting them out to the polls. He is, and they're voting. They're voting with their feet, basically. So we can't dismiss them as, you just don't understand, you're an idiot. You can't do that. It's truly disrespectful to voters. But the same problem that Catherine brings up is if you just, it shouldn't be seen as that you're a traitor to the candidate if you say, he said this, but really experts think it won't be quite that way, and here's what they think it will do to the deficit. That shouldn't be perceived as you're against the candidate, because you can do that for Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Rubio and Cruz and Trump and everybody. So I don't know that we can control for that. I can't control people's anger. You can just do your best work and put the information out there.
If I can just real quick on that, I think, and I don't know how true this actually is what I'm going to say, but essentially I think part of the fear out there is that the world is moving more quickly than people are ready for, and I'm not sure what facts can assuage you that how to fix that. And so I think that's part of the issue, is that there's just this feeling outside in the world, and we don't really know about it in here, and so I don't know how we speak to that, to be honest. Exactly.
And people don't believe numbers, right? There's a lot. I get conspiracy theories all the time about the unemployment rate is wrong, and there's secret hyperinflation that the government won't report. And if those are the pieces of evidence that you're relying on to help people understand things, and they believe that there's a conspiracy out there to taint the evidence, I don't know what you use instead.
So I'm in mind of Senator Moynihan's famous phrase about we're all entitled to our own opinions, but not our own facts. And it appears that now we're all entitled to our own facts, too, and that seems to make a political debate very difficult. Mr. Rosati. Wait for the mic.
Trump becomes the Republican nominee, and let's say it's against Clinton. How do you think this whole talking about how the media, how will it change in the general election? Will it change? You're all talking about facts again. Won't everybody just say you're favoring Clinton?
Clinton doesn't feel that way.
Well, yeah. I don't plan to change my coverage if he's the nominee or if he's the president. I'm going to keep doing my job until they fire me. So I hope he will talk more substantively about the issues. I think if he's elected president, he is going to be, I believe him when he says he's a negotiator. He does make deals. So when you look at his tax plan, I not only do I know in general a candidate's tax plan never comes to fruition in its entirety or in part, but with him as president in particular, I can't believe he won't be cutting lots and lots and lots of deals. So it's not going to be nearly as big or misguided as people may think his plan is now.
There's a sense in the establishment, and they could be wrong again, that essentially he doesn't know much about policy. So if you get him in the office, maybe he won't be as maybe he'll be more open to ideas that Rubio or Cruz wouldn't be because he has never studied this stuff before. I don't know if that's true or not, but
He's going to get the best people,
exactly,
the terrific people.
Right.
But he is smart enough to win these. I mean, we have to keep that in mind. He has outwitted everyone. So while his experience may not be on the policy front, it's a danger to us to underestimate his capacity to do
Let's hear from another former IRS commissioner, Fred Goldberg.
At great risk, I would like to ask you three personal questions. One is, do you think that this alleged anger of the poorly educated is not justified? Second, do you think the establishment is deserving of unquestioned trust and faith? And the third is the comment about facts, and I don't mean to pick on anyone. It is factually accurate the way you portrayed the impact of Bush's proposal on his tax returns. Do you think that is a truthful description and portrayal of his proposals? You don't have to answer any of these questions.
Or you can answer any one of them if you'd like. That's actually an interesting question that journalists wrestle with for a long time about the difference between facts and truth. And I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that.
The fourth question would be, is there truth? Yes, these are men.
You're channeling your inner Hunter Thompson, who used to make that argument all the time.
And all those guys who write this one.
Anybody want to tackle any of Fred's questions? Jean?
more broadly, I can't speak to the anger of a particular demographic, but I do think what I see in reader comments and people I talk to for stories is that the anger against the top 1% and the anger from the top 1%, have ratcheted up a lot. So, and I think that the anger of the top 1% of being portrayed as these greedy monsters, that doesn't really get enough play, frankly, because there are, every time I hear that from both sides, I think, well, guess what? Lawmakers from both parties made this dumb tax code. You all can take advantage of it in different ways, and guess what? The middle class aren't overtaxed. They have plenty and plenty and plenty of tax breaks. Now, they may be badly targeted and all of that, but I think everybody's a little too angry about their own situation, broadly. I can't speak to the poorly educated versus, that's not my bailiwick, so.
Anybody else want to tackle this question about sort of the elitism of journalism? Are we part of the establishment? Are you all part of the establishment?
I mean, I think I am. I work at the Washington Post. I mean, I don't know what, it's not where, I'm not at an alt weekly, I'm at an old brand that carries certain connotations. And to your question about should we have unquestioning faith in the establishment, in expertise? No. And certainly There's a lot of deserved anger, I think, about experts missing major catastrophes, including the financial crisis, which is part of the reason I think people are so reluctant to trust the experts. But I think it's partly that. It's partly sort of talk radio and sort of the consistent pummeling of the elites. So I think that it's justified, but there's also some hyperbolic rhetoric there as well. That said, I don't know that the alternative is to just throw out everyone who, like, not listen to anybody who has a PhD or whatever. I mean, which seems to kind of be where we're headed right now. I think you can take what experts say, take what the elites say, people in the establishment say, and take it into consideration and try to use judgment. I mean, like, that's why politicians themselves are generally not experts on some issue. They have advisors. Part of what you're voting for is someone with sound judgment who can kind of sort out the advice that they're getting, which may be, which may be conflicting. There's no one-handed economist, for example. You want somebody who has sound judgment, but they should be taking under advisement the advice that they're getting. And that's what worries me, that it's like there's this wholesale rejection of anybody who purports to know anything about anything. And instead, we should just kind of go with our gut and say, well, the plan speaks for itself, or the candidate speaks for himself. And that's what's worrisome to me. I don't know that it's an either or. It's like you either have to trust everything that Harvard professors say or trust nothing that they say, but it seems like we've kind of swung too far in the opposite direction.
Time for one or two more questions. Diane, you had one?
I'm Diane Lim. I'm with the Committee for Economic Development. I was wondering if the panelists thought that the reason why people distrust or label fact-based analysis as part of the establishment or the elite is because of the kinds of facts we're presenting to the American public and the analyses we do, that they're very hard for regular people to understand, because they're very, when we talk about all the costs of these big tax cuts, we're talking trillions of dollars over 10 years, and to the average person, it doesn't mean anything, both because it's such a large number and also because I think a lot of the American public thinks that what the government is arguing about or what the politicians are arguing about is just a Washington, D.C. thing, and it has absolutely nothing to do with their own lives. And so I'm wondering if the answer is for we establishment and elite type analysts to start doing a more careful job at translating our analysis into terms that ordinary people can understand, and not just all the rest of us who always talk to each other and always listen to each other.
Okay, last quick answer, and then we'll turn to Senator Wyden.
Well, that would be super helpful for us, because we have to do that anyway. But I don't know. I didn't have enough coffee this morning, I think, because talking about the establishment automatically sets up this group that it just, I really didn't have enough coffee, I'm sorry. I think that people should be respectful of knowledge and expertise and experience. I also think we should be careful of what we call facts. I mean, even when we do, Tax Policy Center does amazing analyses, but they are all estimates. It is their best judgment directionally of where something's going, and I feel much better about it when it sort of parallels what others have said, even if the numbers are different. So I'm sure I've made the mistake of presenting it as facts, and I shouldn't. I should backtrack and say this is an estimate, and here are their assumptions, and you could look at it a different way. But again, I don't think you can convince all the people all the time that something is important or useful. So
You have the last word. Thank you all very much.